Hey guys, as we wind down tonight, we walk not through forests or fields, but through corridors lined with velvet curtains and the faint smell of incense. The marble beneath your feet is cold, polished, and unforgiving. The silence is so deep it hums. Candles flicker in gold holders shaped like vines, but the light does little to push back the gloom. You pass frescoes that were supposed to inspire awe, but they mostly make you feel like you've done something wrong. And maybe you have. You're in the Vatican, but not for a blessing. You're here to meet the other ones. Not the saints, not the scribes, not the quiet, gentle men who copied scripture with trembling hands and too thin ink. No, tonight you'll be spending time with the disappointments of divine leadership, the popes whose resumes were complicated, the ones who bribed, blundered, brawled, and sometimes simply forgot the celibate part of the job description. And you might not survive this one, because you're not just reading about them. You're standing in their shoes, which, unfortunately, are Italian leather, sized too small, and smell like guilt and expensive wine. So, before you settle in, feel free to give the video a like and hit subscribe if you're truly enjoying the journey. You can also leave a comment. Let me know where you are listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder to see people tuning in from so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum in the background, and together, let's ease into tonight's story. Being a papal assistant in the 10th century sounds prestigious at first. You imagine quills and velvet, polite Latin murmurs, echoing off marble, perhaps a dignified stroll through a sunlit cloister now and then. But reality hits like a poorly flung censer. You don't glide through halls of wisdom. You shuffle, half awake, clutching a scroll that smells like mildew, following a pope who may or may not remember your name, but definitely remembers which side of his robe you're allowed to walk on. Your day begins before sunrise, always. There's no alarm, only the rhythmic bell toll that rings like a judgment passed directly into your bones. You dress in heavy robes, stiffer than your spine, soaked through from last night's rain, because the roof above your quarters has been pending repair for 6 months, and pending in papal Latin means never. The incense hits next. It wafts through every hallway, clinging to every thread of your tunic, stinging your eyes just enough to make you cry without emotion. It never leaves. Even your laundry smells like sanctified smoke. By midday, your tongue tastes like you've been licking holy ash, and you probably have, accidentally, more than once. Tasks vary. Some days you're copying letters at a desk that tilts like it's lost the will to support itself. Other days, you're fetching secret messages from cardinals who refuse to say anything out loud, as if the pigeons might be spies. Occasionally you're handed a wax-sealed scroll and told, deliver this, and don't read it, which sounds simple, until the message ends up being an excommunication order for the man who just offered you soup and a place to sit. You imagine these errands will elevate you, open doors, secure favor. They don't. You'll be lucky if anyone remembers to feed you. What you actually get is an ulcer from stress and wine that's more vinegar than vintage. The Pope's temper is mercurial saintly in the morning, thunderous by supper. One wrong word, one crumpled parchment, and you're reassigned to the archives, which is code for a room where scrolls go to rot and assistants go to disappear. You hoped for philosophical debates, sacred learning, deep spiritual fulfillment. Instead, you spend hours untangling who bribed whom, who slept with whom, and who's currently plotting to quietly replace the current pope with a cousin who smiles less and stabs more. You attend meetings where nothing is decided, arguments where everything is whispered, and processions where your job is to hold a candle, not blink, and definitely not fall. One time you did blink. You tripped, dropped the candle, and singed the hem of the Pope's stole. You still dream about it. The silence afterward was louder than any scolding. And food. Bread, if you're lucky. Bread with weevils, if you're not. Cheese that sweats more than you do. Soup made of broth, mystery, and guilt. You eat standing up, because chairs are for clergy who matter, and your knees have become theologians in their own right, constantly praying for relief. But you don't complain, because you know the rules. Quiet suffering is divine. Visible exhaustion is humble, and visible dissatisfaction, that's dangerous. There's no comfort, there's no glory, there's no peace. You think you'll be spending most of your time transcribing scripture, maybe illuminating a few letters with gold leaf, if you're feeling particularly inspired. But no, most of your days are spent in what the older assistants call the cloakroom, though there are no cloaks, and it's not really a room. It's a damp corridor wedged between the treasury and the latrines, which means you're constantly choosing between the smell of old coins and something less poetic. It's the Vatican's unofficial storage for broken furniture, half-melted candles, and boxes of papal correspondence no one wants to sort, which now means you. Ink is your second tormentor. Not the philosophical kind, the real, sticky, tar-like substance that dries in the pot when you need it and spills across your only copy of the Nicene Creed the moment you sneeze. If you want more, you don't just ask. You submit a formal request, countersigned by two superiors, one of whom hasn't been seen since Lent. You trek 3 hallways down to the supply steward, who stares at you like you've asked for the Pope's slippers, sighs dramatically, and gives you a thimbleful of ink that smells like boiled despair. The quills are no better. You're told to sharpen your own, which sounds noble until you realize every assistant shares the same blunt pen knife. It's barely sharp enough to shave a feather, let alone carve a writing point. You spend 30 minutes sculpting a single quill and end up with something that looks like a bird tried to escape mid-process. Then there's the silence. You imagine monastic quietude. Instead, it's weaponized stillness, the kind that makes every cough feel like heresy, every dropped scroll like a declaration of war. Sometimes a fellow assistant shuffles by, eyes sunken, hands ink-stained, whispering prayers under their breath not to God, but to Saint Scribus, the patron saint of keeping it together. You once made the mistake of humming while writing. Just a small tune, something your mother used to sing when you were nervous. Within seconds, Father Morris appeared behind you like a particularly judgmental statue, said nothing, but placed a finger on your lips, then disappeared. You still don't know where he came from. You've checked for trapdoors. Lunch is a confusing affair. There is no official break, just a vague understanding that if you're not actively bleeding or copying something sacred, you might be permitted to chew quietly in a corner. Bread again. Slightly less mold this time. You learn to savor the thrill of small decay. You had dreams once. You thought assisting the Pope meant proximity to wisdom, to revelation, to something meaningful. But mostly it means proximity to very old men arguing about commas in Latin. And the most sacred phrase you hear all day is, "Move the candle closer, my eyes are fading." Still, you stay, because no one else will explain the Pope's schedule to him. Because if you leave, the ink will win. And because even in a corridor that smells like fermented cloth, you've started to understand something. Faith doesn't always arrive in sunbeams. Sometimes it hides behind a cracked wax seal, folded 5 times, and labelled urgent, in a hand that shakes too much to finish the word. You are not a servant, at least not officially. You are an assistant to the Holy See, a guardian of divine documents, a witness to sacred deliberation. That's the theory. In practice, today you're carrying the Pope's laundry, which includes a pair of socks so holy they've developed holes in all the wrong places. You hold them at arm's length, as if reverence might work by proximity. They smell like a forgotten confession, one that involved fish stew and penance through sweating. No one told you about this part. The errands, the quiet nods from bishops that somehow translate into fetching, carrying, cleaning, and occasionally translating curses mumbled in drunken Latin. One bishop calls you quill boy. Another calls you that face. You're not sure which is more accurate anymore. You try to hold on to purpose. You tell yourself you are here to serve history. But history, it seems, is written in layers of bureaucracy, poorly preserved parchment, and ink that refuses to dry properly. And about that ink this morning you spilled it. A single, careless elbow, and now Psalm 119 has a new interpretation. The blot of the righteous is confusing and large. You tried to clean it. You even prayed. The blot got bigger. You brace for punishment. Maybe exile to the scriptorium basement, or being assigned to the Bishop of Smells, who is reportedly working on theological justifications for bathing. But nothing happens, because nobody notices, because your mistake joins 100 others, folded into papal history like a wrinkle in an old robe, unpleasant, but tolerated. The afternoons stretch. Your hands cramp from writing. The candles burn low. The air is thick with the smell of melting tallow and ambitious theology. You imagine you are not here. You imagine a life in the countryside, maybe with a donkey and a woman who can laugh without covering her mouth. But then someone coughs, the Pope waves a finger vaguely in your direction, and you're back hauling another book that weighs as much as regret. You once tried to ask a question. You raised your hand gently during a morning council. Something about a translation error in a letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople. The room went still. Every head turned. The Pope looked at you as if you'd just asked whether he preferred goats or Satan. You didn't ask again. Evening arrives not like a comfort, but a truce. You are released to your cell, not a prison cell, just a room small enough to confuse the distinction. One stool. One mattress stuffed with straw, hope, and several unidentified noises. You lie back and feel your vertebrae form a new shape. You still believe in some way, but belief bends. It bends like candle wax, like the spine of a man who's written the same word 15 times and still isn't sure it means anything anymore. You thought the Vatican would be a place of lofty thought and divine contemplation, but it turns out it's more of a whisper factory, where every syllable carries the weight of a potential conspiracy, and no one ever says exactly what they mean. Today, for instance, a cardinal coughs twice during morning mass, which in your world might simply mean dust, but here sends 3 assistants running in different directions to inform different factions. One thinks it's a sign of impending resignation. Another believes it means someone will be poisoned by supper. You're just trying not to sneeze. Every hallway echoes. Every door creaks in a way that makes you feel like you've been caught doing something, even if you're standing still. You quickly learn that walking too fast looks suspicious. Walking too slowly also looks suspicious. Stopping to read a document aloud to yourself. That's dangerous. And heaven help you if someone catches you making a copy of a letter for practice. They don't believe in innocent intentions here, only motives you haven't yet confessed. Your hands have ink stains that no soap can scrub out, not that soap is common. The communal washing basin contains something the other assistants claim is water, but smells like the memory of a wet sandal. You dip your fingers in, grimace, and accept that cleanliness, like truth, is mostly symbolic in these walls. The Pope's chambers are sacred, but not quiet. People move in and out like mice, furtive, soft-footed, and always carrying something folded or sealed. You're sent in once a day to dust the lectern, though you're not really dusting. You're checking which scrolls have been moved, which books have been replaced. You're told not to ask questions, and by now you don't. One question cost your friend Linus his role. One simple, curious question about a missing charter, and now Linus is transcribing grain tallies in a monastery so remote, even the monks aren't sure what it's called. Silence becomes your defense. You perfect the art of nodding without agreeing, smiling without approving, and copying without reading too deeply. Every sentence you commit to parchment might later be used to defend or destroy someone. You once wrote a document declaring a bishop's divine virtue. The next week, you copied the record of his excommunication. You used the same quill for both. Lunch is now a luxury that involves chewing quickly and forgetting what you're eating. Probably lentils. Possibly regret. The cook doesn't tell, and you've stopped asking. If it's warm and doesn't crunch in the wrong places, you consider it a feast. You don't know who to trust anymore. One assistant likes you too much. Another never speaks but always knows when you're watching. The youngest one, bright-eyed, hopeful, clean sleeves, reminds you of yourself 6 months ago. You want to warn him. You want to say, don't read the letters. Don't ask why the ink smells strange. Don't smile when they tell you to burn something. But you don't. You just nod. You just write. Because in the Vatican, faith is one thing. But survival, that's written in invisible ink. The days are long, but the nights are worse. You thought the worst of your duties would be over by sunset, But that's not how the Vatican works, not in the 10th century. Not when power sleeps lightly and paranoia never sleeps at all. The Pope keeps odd hours. Sometimes he wants his letters read aloud at midnight. Sometimes he simply wants to pace, muttering about false brethren and needing someone to follow behind with a lantern and an appropriately serious expression. That someone is you. Congratulations. You carry the lantern. It sputters with a flame that prefers not to exist. Every gust of wind from a corridor crack threatens to snuff it out. You try shielding it with your hand, your sleeve, even a copy of the Book of Psalms, which now has a new burn mark shaped like disappointment. The Pope doesn't notice. Or if he does, he says nothing. He just walks. One hand behind his back, one finger pointed occasionally at the ceiling, mumbling things you're fairly certain aren't from Scripture. You want to ask if he's all right. You want to say, "Holy Father, perhaps you should sit." But popes do not sit when you suggest it. They sit when the room, the hour, and the heavens align in bureaucratic approval. So instead you follow. 1 corridor. 2. Past the statues that leer. Past the guard who pretends not to see you. Past the tapestry that always flutters despite the lack of wind which you're starting to suspect is alive. Your feet ache. The shoes are leather, but not your size, and definitely not padded. They squeak slightly, which wouldn't be a problem, except you're supposed to be quiet. So now, with every step, your foot sings a tiny song of failure, and you curse your toes for having the audacity to exist. Sometimes the Pope stops, suddenly, and turns. You freeze. Your breath tries to hide inside your lungs. He stares for a moment, as if about to say something profound, something world-altering. But instead, he mutters. They moved the candle again, and resumes walking. You nod, as if that meant something. Later, you return to your chamber. You don't undress, you're too tired to fight the knot in your robe. The straw mattress crunches. Something underneath moves. You choose to believe it's a friendly mouse, or divine retribution in rodent form. Either way, you let it be. You close your eyes. The scent of melted wax still clings to your sleeves. You've breathed it for so many hours, you half expect your dreams to smell like it too. But before sleep comes, you remember the Pope asked for a reply to be delivered at dawn. You forgot. There's no time to fix it now, just enough time to whisper an apology to the ceiling. Tomorrow you'll pay for it. Ceremonial duties sound noble. In theory. You expected majesty cloaks sweeping across polished stone, choirs humming with celestial precision, maybe the occasional glimpse of heavenly light through a stained glass window. But what you get is a week-long rehearsal for a ritual involving 6 cardinals, a silver basin, 17 Latin phrases, and exactly 2 candles, one of which refuses to stay lit, and the other which burns at an angle that scorches the Pope's sleeve if you're not careful. You are, of course, in charge of the candles. You don't know how this happened. One day you were fetching ink. The next, you were handed a wax stick and told it represents divine illumination. Now, you're balancing flame, timing, and the Pope's proximity to flammable materials. It's less sacred, more juggling act performed in slow motion. The stakes, eternal shame, or at the very least, getting reassigned to copying the Book of Numbers again, a fate so dull it makes you consider open rebellion by comma placement. The ceremony begins. The chapel is packed with murmuring nobility, the kind who wear velvet indoors and judge you with their necks. You stand by the altar, candle raised, trying to look both reverent and entirely invisible. The first line of the liturgy is read. Latin flows like old honey slow, slightly crusted around the edges and likely mispronounced. You know it's wrong. The Pope knows it's wrong, but no one stops. Stopping implies failure, and failure implies humility, which no one scheduled for today. You almost laugh. Almost. But your lips know better than to twitch. You've trained them. You've trained every part of your face to look interested, awake and unbothered, even while your arms are trembling from holding the candle for 28 minutes straight. No one told you the wax would drip. It does. Slowly, purposefully onto your knuckles. You flinch just slightly. A bishop sees. He nods, approving your suffering as proof of devotion. Then someone drops a psalter. It hits the stone floor with a thud that feels like a theological earthquake. Everyone pretends it didn't happen. Even the Pope keeps reading. You bend to pick it up, candle still upright, and perform a movement that can only be described as divine contortionism. Your back cracks, your shoe squeaks. A child in the crowd giggles. You consider joining them. You don't. After the ceremony, no one thanks you. No one even looks at you. The Pope retires. The cardinals disperse like pigeons with better hats. You're left with the half-melted candles, a scorch mark on your cuff, and the lingering smell of incense and disappointment. Back in your cell, your fingers are stiff, dotted with wax burns. You could pray, but honestly, you're too tired. You lie back and stare at the ceiling. You wonder if the Pope remembers your name. You wonder if it matters. And you wonder, not for the first time, whether eternal salvation might require less candle management. There are no comfortable chairs in the Vatican. That's the first thing you notice after enough weeks in service. There are thrones, certainly vast, gilded, heavily embroidered. But those are for men who don't carry things. You, unfortunately, do. And when you aren't carrying scrolls, you're standing behind someone who's arguing about them. Sitting is for the consecrated, the elevated, or the too old to be moved. Everyone else stands until their legs learn the holy virtue of numbness. Today, you're stationed behind a dispute one involving 3 monks, a bishop, and a letter written with the wrong ink. It sounds trivial. It is, but it's also taken up most of your morning. The ink was supposed to be from Ravenna, not Rome. The shade is slightly off, and now someone's accusing someone else of forgery. The word heresy is tossed in casually, the way a baker might sprinkle flour, just enough to thicken the tension without committing to a fire. Your job is to hold the original letter, not say a word, and pretend not to notice that the bishop's spittle has landed squarely on your sleeve. You nod when appropriate. You don't blink too much. You adjust your weight from foot to foot until your knees threaten rebellion. Somewhere between the second and third accusation, you begin to envy the inkpot. At least it gets to sit. The monks start coughing. It's winter. The air is cold enough to preserve fish, but there's no fire too dangerous with so many scrolls. So you shiver quietly. One monk coughs so hard he stumbles. A drop of ink leaps onto the letter in your hand. A perfect, treasonous dot. They all see it. No one mentions it. You turn the page and pretend it didn't happen. That's diplomacy. You miss sunlight. There's almost none here. The Vatican corridors are narrow, walled with stone, and lit by grudging windows. When a shaft of morning light does appear, it falls in exactly the wrong place onto the floor, far from where you stand. You tried standing in it once. A passing priest cleared his throat and gestured elsewhere. You haven't tried again. Lunch is late. It always is after disputes. You're given half a bowl of lentil mash and a corner of bread hard enough to audition as masonry. You eat on your feet. There's nowhere to sit. A senior clerk passes, raises an eyebrow, and reminds you that idle posture is the devil's saddle. You nod, as if your spine is not plotting revenge. That afternoon, the Pope decides to review hymns. You do not sing. You stand. You hold the parchment. You resist the urge to sway. The cantor sings off-key. The Pope hums along. Someone falls asleep and is nudged awake with a cane. You make no sound. You make no impression. You are the background. And even in silence, you somehow manage to be too loud. The papal library is not what you imagined. You thought it would be grand shelves of knowledge reaching heavenward, scrolls arranged by wisdom and weight, a place where every breath felt sacred and every footstep was a hymn. But no, the reality is dust, creaking floorboards, and a smell that hovers somewhere between vinegar and old leather left too long in a confessional. The books, if you can call them that, are a scattered collection of parchment bundles, half-wrapped in fading linen, stacked in ways that suggest gravity is more of a suggestion than a rule. And there are rats. Not aggressive, but not afraid either. They move with the entitlement of scholars, pausing to sniffing pots, and occasionally chew on the corners of ancient commentaries. You once saw one sitting atop a volume of St. Augustine, grooming itself as if pondering original sin. Today, Your task is to find a specific manuscript, a letter from Pope Nicholas I to the Patriarch of Constantinople, concerning something about theological tone. No one's quite sure if it was ever written, or if it exists, or if it matters. But the Pope asked for it, which means your belief in its existence is now mandatory. You begin with the end shelf, only to discover there are no shelves labelled by letter. The assistant before you had a system. He died. No one asked what it was. So now you're flipping through bundles tied with string, stained with time, and often mislabeled. One reads Eucharistic hymns, but contains trade records and a recipe for pickled onions. The light is bad. The windows are narrow, the candles short, the dust thick enough to sketch disappointment in. Your nose runs. Your fingers smudge. You sneeze once, and a stack of documents collapses in protest. You spend the next half hour stacking history, one regret at a time. Hours pass. No manuscript. You try to report this gently. You explain to the cardinal that the letter may not be in the archive. He stares at you with the soft horror of a man who just realized he's misplaced God's opinion. He sends you back in. This time, he adds, try harder. You consider pretending to find it. You consider forging it. You even draft the opening lines in your head to the Patriarch. In holy friendship, may your incense burn sweet and your heresies be few. But you don't. You've seen what happens to assistants who improvise. Instead, you keep looking. You check boxes marked misc. You open scrolls written in Greek you can't fully read. You consult a monk who smells like thyme and sorrow. He tells you the manuscript may have been lost in a fire, or never copied, or dreamed by someone long dead and remembered as real. By the end of the day, your hands are ink-streaked, your eyes gritty, and your mind filled with theological terms that sound increasingly like curses. You haven't found the letter, but you have found a growing sense that truth in the Vatican is often a matter of paperwork, memory, and whoever can speak Latin the loudest. You don't go outside often. Not because you're forbidden, but because you're forgotten. Most of your world is stone corridors and second-hand whispers. So when someone finally remembers you have legs and sends you into the city on an errand, you feel something dangerously close to hope. Fresh air, movement, a sky. It sounds refreshing. It is not. The errand, in theory, is simple. Deliver a small reliquary box gilded, awkwardly heavy, allegedly containing a saint's fingernail to a bishop 2 districts away. It should take an hour. But nothing in Rome takes an hour, unless that hour is a metaphor for 3. You cradle the box like it might bite you. It rattles ominously. You try not to wonder whether the fingernail is real. You try not to imagine it scratching at the lid. You fail on both counts. The streets are cobbled, uneven, and slick with last night's rain. Your shoes, which barely fit on dry marble, betray you immediately. Within 20 steps, one heel slips, and you perform a half dance, half theological miracle, just to stay upright. A donkey stares at you like it's seen better assistance. It has. The city smells different. Less incense, more fermented cabbage, horse, and something unidentifiable that you decide not to question. The crowd doesn't part for you. You're not important enough for that. You sidestep vendors, duck under laundry lines, and nearly walk into a fishmonger whose stall is more fish than wood. Every minute outside, your robes absorb more filth, becoming a travelling display of Roman street composition, mud, hay, spilled wine, and regret. Halfway there, it starts to rain again. Not a gentle mist, but a slapstick deluge. The reliquary box gets slippery. Your arms ache. You find a ledge to stand under, but a passing cart splashes you anyway. The box nearly drops. The saint inside rattles in protest. You whisper an apology to the finger. You finally reach the bishop's gate. You're soaked, cold, and steaming faintly from exertion. The guard eyes you with suspicion, as if only heretics deliver relics in the rain. You hand over the box, bow and wait. No one says thank you. No one invites you in. You're told next time be earlier. You walk back with empty hands and heavier feet. The rain lets up just as you arrive at the Vatican, which feels like divine mockery. You pass 2 monks in dry robes and polished sandals. They nod without recognition. You nod back like a relic yourself once valuable, now shelved. Back in your cell, you peel off the robe. It makes a sound like wet betrayal. You wring it out. Water and shame dribble to the floor. You don't even bother with fresh clothes. You lie on the straw, hair damp, limbs sore, and try to remember what sunlight looked like before it came with mud and silence. Tomorrow, there will be another errand. Another box. Maybe a tooth this time. Maybe something worse. Some days you're sent to confession. Not as penitent, not officially, but to observe the flow of matters, which is how the senior assistants describe sitting outside the confessional booth with a wax tablet and the spiritual equivalent of a bucket. You aren't supposed to listen. Of course you listen. The walls are thin, the acoustics generous, and people speak loudly when they think they're whispering to God. You hear everything. The same sins again and again. Someone stole bread. Someone lied about taxes. Someone kicked a goat. Sometimes someone kicks the same goat 3 weeks in a row and still feels surprised that it's a sin. You wonder if the goat is also tired. You consider writing down the confession itself just to track the repetition, not out of piety, but out of administrative curiosity. Meanwhile, the priest inside murmurs Latin half-sentences, some of which are grammatically questionable. You wince. You know better. You've copied better. You've had nightmares about incorrectly declined nouns. And now you're listening to a cardinal conjugate like a man with a fever and a vendetta against syntax. But you say nothing. You just scratch notes about penance fines and the occasional almsgiving order. You're the quiet eye of a spiritual storm, a sponge with a robe and a wax stylus. You are, above all things, forgettable. Once, someone confessed something stranger. Something about a body and a bridge and a promise broken in the dark. You glanced up. The priest didn't react. You expected some alarm, or maybe a papal guard leaping from behind a tapestry. Nothing happened. The penitent was told to fast and reflect. You reflected too, mostly on how easy it was to speak into a screen and expect forgiveness. You wonder what you'd say, if it were you in there. Would you confess the ink you wasted? The document you forged when no one was looking? The thought you had last week, that maybe God's silence isn't mystery but disinterest? You wouldn't say it. You couldn't. You'd mutter something about lateness or laziness, and pretend that was the worst of it. Afternoons like this end with sore fingers and a stiff back. You return the tablet. No one thanks you. No one asks if it was heavy. You're told to keep the files sorted. Files, in this case, being a bundle of notes tied with fraying twine and labelled with Latin abbreviations so obscure they might be jokes. At dusk, you sit by the door of the vestry, pretending to catalogue hymnals. You look at the sun, or at least what remains of it, slipping behind the dome. You wonder what would happen if you left. If you just kept walking, out of the Vatican, past the guards, past the judgment. You wonder how long it would take before they noticed you were gone. And the quietest part of you knows the answer. They'd notice. But only when someone else forgets the Pope's lunch. You'd think being born into the most powerful family in Rome would come with a sense of purpose, or at least a sense of consequence. But when you are Octavianus, the future Pope John XII, you don't grow up imagining sainthood. You grow up surrounded by silk, suspicion, and wine poured too early in the day. Your father is Duke Alberic II, a man who essentially runs the city with one hand on the treasury and the other pointing at enemies, real or imagined. You are his son, his heir, and as it turns out, his papal contingency plan. When you're 12, you receive a blessing. Not from God, but from your father, in the form of a very public demand. You will be Pope when the current one dies. Not if, not perhaps, not should you be called. Simply when. It's said as casually as a man announcing the weather, though it carries the same finality as thunder. You nod, not because you understand, but because when Alberic speaks, you nod. There are tutors, of course. You are taught Latin, scripture, and the finer points of pretending to listen. But more than anything, you're taught how not to die. Poison is common. Knives are cheaper than diplomacy, and loyalty is something you rent, not own. You learn to drink, just enough to be sociable, but not enough to be careless. You learn to smile like a politician, all teeth, no truth. And you learn to speak as if everything you say has already been misquoted. By the time you're 18, the old pope is dead. Whether by natural causes or unnatural influence remains unrecorded, but the timing is convenient. You are appointed pope without debate. The ceremony is grand, crowded, and confusing. You kneel in robes that don't quite fit and accept a crown that feels more like a dare than a blessing. Everyone expects you to grow into the role. You don't. You grow around it. Like ivy around a crumbling wall, decorative, clinging, and not especially concerned with the structural integrity underneath. You enjoy the trappings, the wine, the power, the endless supply of people too afraid to say no. You build alliances not with theologians but with mercenaries. You hold council in bedchambers. You conduct diplomacy with the subtlety of a thrown goblet. The Vatican, by now, hums with the sound of scandal. Priests whisper. Cardinals sigh. The people in the street shrug and invent dirtier nicknames. You hear them, of course. You're not deaf. But you don't care. Or maybe you do, just not in the right way. Respect is for saints. You're something else entirely. And through it all, your father's shadow lingers. Even dead, he's louder than most men living. You try to escape it not by rejecting his legacy, but by exaggerating it. You turn the volume up on everything. More gold, more women, more risk. You are not a pope. You are an echo with ambition. And Rome, poor Rome, simply tries to keep up. Being pope means many things. It means spiritual authority. It means political power. It means your face carved into medallions, your name sung in masses, and your decisions echoed in churches from Milan to the edge of Christendom. But when you are Pope John XII, it mostly means knowing which wine cellars have the best stock, which palaces have the quietest servants, and which noble families are most likely to pretend they didn't see you slipping out of their daughters' rooms at dawn. You turn the Lateran Palace into something between a sanctuary and a tavern. The throne room smells not of incense, but of perfume and clove-spiced wine. The velvet cushions stick faintly to the skin if you sit too long, not from reverence, but from summer heat and the residue of too many banquets served where decisions were meant to be made. You hold audiences with bishops while someone plays a lute in the next room. You sign decrees with fingers still sticky from honeyed figs. Sometimes you forget what you're signing. Sometimes you don't read them at all. A scribe coughs gently and points to the blank space. You sign anyway. Rome starts to notice. Not at first they laugh. The idea of a young pope throwing parties feels like a curiosity, a new legend in the making. But curiosity turns to complaint when the parties don't stop. When church bells ring late, because the sacristan is still asleep. When clerics appear with bruises and excuses. Whispers grow. They always do. They wrap around you like incense smoke, sweet and choking. Some say you consecrated a deacon in a brothel. Others say you gambled away church treasures. One particularly determined rumour claims you invoked Jupiter during a mass. You don't deny any of it. Denial requires effort. And effort, lately, feels optional. Your advisors begin resigning, politely. One leaves a note. Another simply disappears. You replace them with cousins, then with mercenaries, then with whoever's still awake and sober when you need a signature witnessed. The line between papal court and private debauchery blurs, until no one bothers pretending there's a difference. You believe yourself untouchable. How could you not? The city bends around you. The cardinals grumble, but they don't rebel. The nobles send their sons to dine with you and their daughters to flirt with you, hoping for favour in the middle of scandal. Power, you think, is not about piety. It's about being the fire everyone's afraid to extinguish. But still, sometimes, late at night, when the palace quiets and even the wine loses its taste, you catch a glimpse of your reflection in a polished basin. The mitre doesn't look right on you. Not because it's too big, but because you wear it like a dare, not a duty. And somewhere in the silence, you wonder if the rumours are the only part of you people will remember. Eventually, your reputation grows too loud to ignore. It spills past Rome, past the churches and cardinals, past the city gates where gossip is usually traded for loaves of bread and curses about taxes. It crosses the Alps, rides up into Saxon lands, and lands directly on the very clean desk of Otto I, King of Germany, future Holy Roman Emperor, and unfortunately for you, a man with an actual work ethic. Otto is not amused. He hears stories of you blessing soldiers who pillaged nearby towns, of you promoting your relatives to high office despite their startling lack of virtue, and of you selling church lands like stale bread at market. He does not laugh. He does not shrug. Otto sharpens his beard, adjusts his helmet, and begins a quiet plan that involves less prayer and more marching. You, meanwhile, remain unconcerned. You've surrounded yourself with flatterers, men who reassure you that Otto is too far away, too busy, too respectful to intervene. You host another feast. Someone sings a song in your honor, rhyming John with dawn and divinely fawned upon. You pretend to enjoy it, though you find the melody tiresome and the chorus slightly off-tempo. Still, it's better than worrying. When Otto arrives in Italy, you're told it's just a diplomatic visit. He wants peace. He wants discussion. He wants, allegedly, to be crowned emperor, and you are the one with the crown. You prepare for ceremony, not negotiation. You polish the throne. You rehearse your Latin. You select your least wine-stained robe. But Otto doesn't want pageantry. He wants accountability. He asks questions. Real ones. The kind that involve dates, ledgers, witnesses. You smile politely. You offer vague answers. He raises an eyebrow. You feel for the first time the quiet click of someone closing a trap you didn't realize you were standing in. Then comes the synod. It's called quickly, officially to address church matters, unofficially to investigate you. The room fills with bishops, some weary, some eager, all watching. They raise accusations. You are not present. You claim illness. Then you claim it's too dangerous to appear. Then you claim divine exemption. The bishops, having heard better excuses from penitent thieves, proceed without you. Otto listens carefully. He does not shout. He does not threaten. He just writes everything down, or worse, he remembers. Names. Dates. Which priest saw what? Which relic went missing? Which letter was forged? Your sins, once laughed off in wine halls, are now listed in order, read aloud, and recorded on papyrus like holy charges filed by reluctant saints. You issue threats from afar. You excommunicate your enemies. You shout that Otto has no right to meddle in papal affairs. Otto says nothing. He stays. That's worse. And for the first time, the golden chair you once ruled from begins to look less like a throne and more like a seat waiting to be vacated. You never really imagined exile. That's something that happens to other popes, theoretical popes. Imaginary popes, the kind they warn about in sermons but never name aloud. You thought yourself immune. But then again, you also thought wine didn't stain silk if you drank it fast enough, and that turned out to be incorrect as well. Otto has had enough. After the synod, after the letters, after the diplomatic silence that spoke louder than any sermon, he installs his own pope, a man named Leo. A man with fewer mistresses, a tighter belt, and absolutely no sense of humour. The people in Rome shrug. Some protest. Most do not. You flee the city before anyone officially calls it fleeing. You say you're travelling. You say it's temporary. You say it's strategic. You keep talking long after the city gates have disappeared behind you. You find yourself in unfamiliar territory, not just geographically, but spiritually. You have no throne, no guards, no crown. Your robe is still rich, but your influence is patchy like a fading mosaic where most of the tiles have fallen off. You rely on old alliances, on sympathetic lords, on people who remember the Pope, who once gave generous titles to mediocre men. You start writing letters. Long, frantic, increasingly desperate letters. You excommunicate Otto. Again. You excommunicate Leo. Then a few bishops. Then some clerks. You seem to be excommunicating everyone except the postman delivering the letters. You imagine them reading your words aloud with horror. In reality, they probably read them over stale cheese and shake their heads. You try to gather support. You promise favours, absolutions, promises of future appointments, but you can feel the distance growing. People who once whispered in your corridors now write polite refusals. We are concerned for your soul, one letter reads. You recognize the handwriting. It belonged to a man who once danced on your table in a wig. You start to regret things. Not publicly, not loudly, but in the quiet, when the candle burns too low and the room feels just a little too big. You wonder what you might have changed. Fewer banquets. Fewer decrees issued after midnight. Maybe taking the role seriously just once to see what it felt like. Rome starts to shift without you. Leo, you hear, is dull but functional. The palace is cleaner. The schedule runs on time. The wine is watered, and the altar candles are replaced regularly instead of repurposed from after parties. You are missed by some, but remembered more like a headache than a holiday, intense, confusing, and not entirely unpleasant in retrospect, but something people are glad to be done with. You don't stop trying. You plan. You plot. You imagine your return. You rehearse your speeches. But you know the truth. Power is heavy, and once it slips off your shoulders, it's harder than you think to pick it back up, especially when everyone's pretending they don't see you reaching. Against all odds, you return. Rome, like an old friend with a selective memory, lets you in again. Not with trumpets or garlands or choirs, but with a sort of passive indifference, as though the city has collectively shrugged and said, well, he's back. Leo is gone, or fled, or quietly encouraged to be somewhere else. The throne is empty. And you, with the same robes, the same smile, the same lingering scent of misused authority, step into it once more. But it isn't the same. The palace doors open for you. Yes, but slower. The guards nod, but not as deeply. The servants respond, but only after a second call. You notice it first in the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the hollow sort that echoes when reverence has left the building. The hallways feel wider now, not because they changed, but because you are no longer large enough to fill them. You try to resume as before. You host a small feast, a modest one, just a handful of familiar faces. The wine flows, the laughter returns almost. But it's thinner. The jokes don't land quite right. Someone offers a toast in your honor, and no one claps. You pretend not to notice, but you do. You notice everything now. You attempt governance. You issue a decree, something simple, something safe. A clerical appointment, a monastery tax exemption. You wait for the usual bustle, the hurried copies, the nods of approval. Instead, there's a pause, a murmur. A clerk asks, gently, if you might review the seal. You realize then that no one's sure if your orders still matter, so you double down. You issue more decrees, louder, bolder. You hold court daily. You require your name to be sung in morning mass. You ask the choir to adjust the key. It's always sounded a little too minor for your liking. You sit on the throne like you mean it, even though it creaks in a way that feels suspiciously like judgment. And still, the city doesn't quite bend. It follows technically, but with the same enthusiasm one uses when complying with a weather report. The energy has shifted. You feel it. You're not the storm anymore. You're the memory of rain. At night, the palace feels colder, not in temperature, but in tone. You walk past doors that used to open. Now they remain shut. You pass by corridors that once held music. Now they hold echoes. You don't admit it aloud, but you speak more often to your reflection. It listens. It agrees. It has no choice. You sleep poorly. The bed is the same. The mattress, the drapes, the carved posts with their flaking gold leaf. But you lie there awake, listening for footsteps that never come, letters that never arrive, applause that no longer exists. You wonder how long you'll be allowed to stay. And the quiet answer comes from the walls themselves, not long. The end, when it arrives, is not ceremonial. It does not wait for daylight, nor does it respect titles, robes, or long-winded sermons. It comes on an ordinary day, beneath an ordinary ceiling, while you are in bed not praying, not reading scripture, not contemplating the mystery of salvation. You are, by all accounts, otherwise engaged. The story goes in stories, by now, are the only currency left to your legacy that you die in bed with someone else's wife. Not quietly, not peacefully, and certainly not with dignity. Some say the woman's husband storms in and strikes you down in a fit of jealous rage. Others suggest a stroke, a seizure, or divine lightning in the shape of a disappointed blood vessel. There are no witnesses, or too many, depending on which cardinal you ask. But the result is the same. You do not rise. You once imagined your death might involve incense, choirs, perhaps a final whispered word that would confuse future theologians. But now it's whispered differently in corners, in taverns, in kitchens where the cooks do not lower their voices anymore. They say, "The Pope is dead," and then they laugh. The irony is thick enough to smear on bread. A man who styled himself as invincible, who defied kings, censured clerics, excommunicated emperors, brought down, finally, by an overheated room, a jealous husband, and whatever disease had been chasing you for years. Your body, for all its indulgence, was never built for endurance. It was built for appetite. No bells are rung, not immediately. The Vatican pauses, not in mourning, but in confusion. No one is quite sure how to announce it. You were Pope, and yet, were you? There are 3 drafts of your last decree. 2 are unfinished. 1 is signed in wine. A few loyalists try to honor you. They wrap the body. They light candles. They whisper prayers that sound less like invocations and more like apologies. The rest move quickly. The palace is swept. Your letters are burned. The brocade sheets are replaced. It's as if Rome, having tolerated your shadow for too long, now wants only to bathe in sunlight and forget. Your enemies call it poetic justice. Your allies, what's left of them, call it untimed timing. The people in the streets call it exactly what they expected. You were always a gamble, a risk dressed in silk. And when the dice finally stopped rolling, no one was surprised to see how they landed. There is no grand burial. There is no posthumous sainthood. Just a body, a box, and a few muttered lines about repentance. A bishop reads them with the tone of someone who would rather be anywhere else. No choir sings. No relic is forged in your honor. A door closes. Dust settles. Life resumes. And if there is a judgment, it does not come in the form of fire or thunder. It comes in silence. The kind that doesn't answer when your name is called. When you die badly, history tends to remember more than it should and less than it ought to. For Pope John XII, your afterlife begins not in heaven or hell. Those details remain fiercely debated, but in the parchment-strewn rooms of the Lateran, where men with ink-stained fingers begin the careful work of forgetting. The process is not immediate. There's a day or 2 of quiet murmuring, hesitant shuffling, and the question no one quite wants to ask out loud: so what do we do now? You, of course, are unavailable for comment. Your body is in the crypt. Your soul is in theological limbo. Your paperwork, however, is very much present, and that's the real problem. You left quite a mess. Not in the spiritual sense, though that's considerable, but in the practical one. Letters sent, policies half implemented, appointments made over dinner and written on napkins, or whatever passed for napkins in the 10th century. No one knows which decrees were official and which were a product of your wine-soaked afternoons. The chancery clerks begin a ritual that will become known, unofficially, as the Great Sorting, which involves long sighs, deep frowns, and phrases like, "What in God's name does this even mean?" Some documents are quietly burned. Others are locked away. A few are edited retroactively, Latin rewritten so smoothly you'd think divine grammar had intervened. You had declared an imperial legate to be a blessed servant of unity. Someone adds a word, a phrase. Suddenly he's just a man of considerable enthusiasm. It changes the tone, and that's enough. The cleaning crews are less poetic. They move through the palace with buckets and salt soap, scrubbing away the residue of your reign. Curtains are replaced. Beds are burned. A tapestry that once showed you in triumph draped in gold, eyes fixed heavenward, is quietly removed and used to patch a stable roof. The Vatican prefers not to keep awkward portraits. There are rumours of a room, your private quarters, where no one will enter. Not because it's cursed, but because it still smells like clove oil, incense, and too many nights spent being someone more than holy. Eventually, someone bribes a monk to air it out. He opens the window and leaves it that way for weeks. Even among the common folk, your memory changes quickly. You were, briefly, a pope of the people, young, loud, visible, But now, you become something else, a cautionary tale. A name muttered when young priests smirk too often, or when the wine jug returns empty. Don't go full John, they say, which means too much, too fast, too far. It means forgetting the difference between reverence and revel. You are remembered, but not for the reasons you hoped, and certainly not for the sermons you never gave. You once believed history would remember you in gold leaf. Glorious, gilded, maybe misunderstood, but never ignored. But now you find yourself living on in parchment scratched, inconsistent, and frequently written by people who did not like you, or worse, did not care. The chroniclers come later. Always later. Men with worn eyes and quills that hesitate just long enough to add a touch of judgment. They gather stories like nettles prickly, half true, often repeated without confirmation but with great enthusiasm. You become a collection of exaggerations, each one stitched onto the last like a robe that was never meant to fit. Some claim you turned the Lateran into a brothel. Others say you drank with demons, though no one agrees on the type. A few whisper that you gambled away sacred relics, using the bones of saints as betting collateral. A monk in Ravenna swears you once slapped a bishop during Mass. Another insists you spoke only in curses and nicknames. None of this is properly sourced. All of it is recorded. The writers don't hate you. That would require effort. They simply find you useful. You are the perfect contrast to shadow beside a future pope's light. A lesson made flesh. A failure in papal form. When they describe holiness, they need its opposite. When they describe reform, they begin with your mistakes. You become an anecdote. A turning point. A page with a very large asterisk and a very small halo. And it sticks. Even the ones who try to be fair can't resist a good story. One cleric writes that you were young, vibrant, and tragically undisciplined. Another describes your papacy as a necessary decay before renewal. A third just scribbles "God help us" in the margin. You start to realize that the truth doesn't matter much after you're gone. It never did. Not when there's parchment to fill and monks to entertain. You're not entirely erased. In dusty libraries your name survives, sometimes between saints, sometimes beside lists of papal scandals. Occasionally, a historian tries to redeem you, to question the accounts, to argue that you were no worse than the times allowed. But even they admit it's difficult when half your documents involve bribes, lovers, or unexplained livestock expenses. And so your afterlife becomes an echo, not sung, not prayed, not venerated, just repeated, softly, in lectures, in warnings, in the footnotes of men who want to sound clever. No one quotes your sermons. There aren't any to quote. No one recites your letters. They were mostly threats. But everyone knows your name, not for what you stood for, but for how far you fell while still wearing a crown. And in the end, the ink says what you never could, once Pope, now punchline. You might think, after all this time, that the Church would find a way to forgive you, that the centuries would soften your image the way moss eventually blurs a sharp stone. And in some cases it does. Even the worst kings sometimes get rebranded. Even heretics occasionally earn footnotes filled with sympathy. But not you. Your name lingers in lists, not the lists of martyrs, not the lists of reformers or scholars or visionaries, but the other ones. The ones no one reads aloud. Most scandalous, most corrupt, least inspiring. You sit comfortably beside medieval anti-popes, fraudulent bishops, and that one unfortunate priest who declared himself the reincarnation of St. Paul and was immediately thrown out a window. But even he had a following. You, however, are remembered for parties. Not the kind that unify nations. Not the kind where treaties are signed or calendars changed, but the kind where no one remembers the second half. Someone ends up in the fountain, and the altar candles are used for things definitely not approved by canon law. It's hard to build a legacy when your defining contribution to church history is excessive revelry. Every few decades, someone brings you up again, usually in a university. Usually during a lecture titled something like Lessons from History's Worst Popes. The professor raises their eyebrows, smiles tightly, and says your name like an incantation. The students chuckle. A few take notes. One or two will repeat your story at dinner parties, slightly exaggerated, significantly more entertaining. The part about the dice game in the sacristy gets longer every year. Still, your record isn't entirely unique. Others failed too. Others sinned. But your failures were flamboyant. Your sins wore bright colours. You didn't just fall short, you danced across the line, handed out wine, and invited witnesses. That's the difference. Quiet corruption survives. Loud misbehaviour gets immortalised. You often wonder, in the abstract sense available to the posthumous, whether you'd have done it differently. Would you have reined yourself in? Would you have made fewer appointments based on flattery and more based on theology? Would you have attended at least one council sober? But those aren't real questions. They're shadows dressed as regrets. You never thought you'd be held to account. You thought the papacy was a fortress. It was a spotlight. And now, centuries later, your legacy is safe in the same way a museum keeps its oddities safe. Under glass. Labelled, gawked at, not loved. Your name is still written, but rarely spoken in prayer. By now, your story has settled into something both strange and final. You are not debated. You are not adored. You are not even hated with much enthusiasm anymore. You are simply referenced, pointed to with an academic shrug, a tired gesture in the direction of what not to do when given the keys to the church and a little too much wine. If popes were chess pieces, you would be the one they hide in the box out of embarrassment, the bishop with a chipped base and a crooked hat. Your tomb still exists, allegedly. No one visits. No one lights a candle. If a tourist happens to pass it, they pause only long enough to squint at the plaque, mispronounce your Latin title, and move on to the next pope who built something, or said something, or something, or at least died in a less ridiculous way. You, on the other hand, died as you lived poorly timed, slightly scandalous, and with too many unanswered questions. Your name, John the 12th, is not cursed, but it is avoided. Later popes will take the name again, but carefully, with heavy sighs and added numbers, as though to distance themselves from your particular flavour of chaos. In papal records, your reign is described as troubled, which is Vatican speak for the less said, the better. The phrase gets reused. It becomes a kind of template. When a pope misbehaves, mildly or otherwise, he is troubled. You set the standard. Congratulations. When people discuss you now, it's mostly in footnotes or in humorous asides during serious documentaries. Someone will say, at least he wasn't as bad as John the 12th, and everyone will nod, relieved that the bar remains somewhere subterranean. Even those who want to rehabilitate your image, those brave few historians who love a lost cause struggle, they point to your youth. They mention political pressures. They mumble something about cultural context. But in the end, you always return to the same 3 paragraphs, indulgent, immoral, and ultimately unmissed. And yet, something of you remains. Not your teachings, not your wisdom, but the echo of what happens when power is handed too easily, when responsibility is mistaken for freedom, when robes are worn like costumes rather than burdens. You are a parable carved in marble and wine stains. In a quiet chapel somewhere, far from Rome, a tired monk once wrote beside your name. He burned hot and faded fast. No one quoted him. No one preserved the parchment. But the sentence still feels right. Because for all the scandal and spectacle, for all the outrages and incidents and whispered rumours in taverns, the truth of your life was simpler. You never believed it would end. And then it did. There is silence now when your name is spoken, not the reverent kind. The uncertain kind. The kind that follows laughter and comes just before someone changes the subject. You thought courtrooms were for the living. That trials required a pulse. That oaths meant something only when spoken by mouths still attached to warm lungs. But then you find yourself in Rome, in the year 897, and you realize that dignity, like compost, can be dug up and flung around for entertainment or politics, which is often the same thing. The courtroom is real. So is the judge. So are the bishops in their stiff chairs, the scribes with their ink-stained fingers, and the guards trying very hard not to make eye contact with anyone. What's not real, at least not anymore, is the defendant. That honour goes to Pope Formosus, deceased. 8 months deceased. Dug up, dragged in, and now propped on a throne, still wearing the robes he was buried in, though time and worms have taken some liberties with the fit. You are there. Not important enough to be seated, but present. Watching. Breathing through your sleeve. The smell is unforgettable, a mix of old incense, damp rot, and something that might once have been papal dignity. The body doesn't move, of course. It sways a little. It leans forward ominously, as if trying to object, then slumps back into silence. A deacon is assigned to answer questions on Formosus's behalf. He is not thrilled about this job. The charges are many, and mostly contradictory: violating canon law, usurping the papal seat, performing sacraments while excommunicated, being pope when someone else thought they should be pope. The trial feels less like justice and more like vengeance performed in Latin. The presiding Pope, Stephen VI, is visibly sweating, either from heat or the sheer effort of keeping a straight face while yelling at a corpse. You expected outrage. What you get is a strange kind of fascinated silence. The bishops nod solemnly. The scribes write dutifully. The crowd leans in. No one stops this. No one questions it. There's a part of you that wants to laugh, another part that wants to run. Instead, you stay rooted like everyone else, watching a man argue with a dead pope and win. Eventually, Formosus is found guilty. Naturally. His papacy is annulled. His acts are reversed. His blessings invalidated. His fingers, the ones used to give benedictions, are cut off with ceremonial scissors that are far too ornate for the task. Someone announces that his body will be reburied in a pauper's grave. Later, that's changed. He ends up in the Tiber. You leave the courtroom unsettled, not because a corpse was tried, but because no one seemed particularly surprised. There is something about a corpse in a courtroom that makes everything else feel absurdly formal. The bishops are still wearing their best robes. The scribes dip their quills with grave focus. The guards shift uncomfortably in their sandals. But the centerpiece, the main attraction, is slumped and vacant, propped upright like an actor who missed his cue, dressed in once white vestments, now the shade of an old bandage. Pope Formosus has been dead for months, but today he's finally being heard by proxy, by grudge, and by force. The deacon assigned to speak on his behalf, the poor man, has a voice like dry parchment, and the expression of someone who knows he will not be promoted for this. He reads the scripted responses in Latin, mechanically, eyes avoiding the corpse beside him. Occasionally, the dead pope tilts. A guard nudges him upright. Once, the head lolls forward. A bishop clears his throat and pretends not to notice. The synod continues, as if all of this is perfectly normal, as though trial by cadaver is just another item on the church's weekly agenda. You find yourself wondering if you're the only one who thinks this is madness. You glance at the others. No one meets your eyes. Some look fascinated. A few look bored. One is chewing something, a fig, maybe. Apparently nothing pairs with ecclesiastical scandal quite like soft fruit. You try to focus. You fail. Your gaze keeps returning to the corpse, its papal ring still loosely clinging to a finger that is beginning to curl inward in protest. Then comes the moment everyone will remember, the removal of the fingers. The ones that blessed, anointed, absolved. Or so they say. They're declared invalid, the blessings, not the fingers, and someone steps forward with shears. Not the usual kind. These are ceremonial, gold-handled, far too ornate for cutting anything other than ribbons or perhaps pride. The snip is too soft. The sound is unsatisfying. The gesture is not. There's a quiet gasp, quickly suppressed. A scribe writes faster. Someone hiccups. The trial continues, but after that moment it's difficult to take anything seriously. A dead man has just been mutilated to make a point that no longer matters. Formosus is stripped of his titles, his robes, his reputation. He is sentenced not to death he already lost, but to irrelevance. His body is declared an offence, his legacy a mistake. And for all the weight behind these declarations, it's the silence in the room that carries the most force. You leave before the sentence is fully read. It's all theatre now, not the good kind. Not tragedy, not comedy. Just farce draped in incense and embroidered shame. Outside, The sun has the nerve to shine. You look up and wonder if heaven blinked, or if it just looked away. You don't expect popes to apologize. Not in public. Not in writing. And certainly not for something that was technically legal, technically supported, and technically horrifying. But here we are, just a few months after the Cadaver Synod, and Pope Stephen VI, the man who dragged a dead pope into a courtroom, is beginning to realize he may have made what theologians call a spectacularly bad decision. At first he defends it. Of course he does. He stands by the verdict, claims it was necessary for the sanctity of the Church, and insists that Formosus had defiled the papal office with ambition and deceit. He speaks sternly. He quotes scripture. He calls the whole grotesque display a cleansing, as though tossing a corpse into the river somehow purifies the soul of Rome. You can almost admire the confidence. Almost. But then the murmurs begin. They start quietly, the way all regrets do behind doors, over wine, beneath the clatter of official business. Bishops speak carefully. Nobles raise eyebrows. The people in the street, the ones who buy bread with bad coins and survive on rumour, begin to whisper that perhaps digging up a pope and putting him on trial like a damp scarecrow wasn't the best demonstration of spiritual maturity. Stephen tries to ignore it. He hosts more ceremonies. He blesses more things. He speaks louder, prays longer, walks slower through the corridors so that his robes billow in a way that suggests control. But it doesn't help. The synod has become a joke, a dark one. And worse, people are starting to remember that the Church is supposed to represent eternal truths, not seasonal revenge. Eventually the backlash becomes too loud to drown out. Riots break out. Not grand, principled riots, but the messy kind fueled by frustration, hunger, and too many clashing versions of truth. A rumour spreads that the river itself rejected Formosus's body, that it washed back ashore, bloated and accusing. No one confirms it. No one has to. The image alone is enough. Stephen orders the synod annulled. The verdict is reversed. Formosus is reburied properly this time, and the Church pretends, briefly, that none of it ever happened. The corpse is forgiven. The crimes are erased. The scissors are tucked away. A new pope is elected not long after. They don't speak of fingers, they speak of unity. As for Stephen, he does not get a peaceful retirement. His robes become heavier, his steps shorter, his authority unravels like cheap ribbon. One morning, he is arrested by a mob, a real one, not metaphorical, not theological, just angry and armed with sticks. He is thrown in prison, and a few weeks later, he is found strangled in his cell. No trial, no ceremony, no parade, and no one digs him back up. There's something persistent about Formosus. For a man who, by every natural and theological standard, should have been allowed to rest, he refuses to leave the conversation. Or maybe the conversation refuses to leave him. Either way, the corpse that sat in court begins to evolve, no longer a man, not really a pope, but something else entirely. A metaphor, a myth, a kind of uncomfortable mascot for everything that can go wrong when religion, power, and personal vendettas climb into bed to bed and forget to wash the sheets. Stories about him begin to spread in strange directions. The scholars argue, of course they always do, but the common people, the ones who never had the luxury of understanding canon law, turn the Cadaver Synod into bedtime horror. Children are told to behave or the dead pope will visit you in your dreams, robes dripping, fingers missing. A tavern song makes the rounds, set to a tune that sounds suspiciously like a funeral dirge, recounting how Formosus floated back from the river, climbed the palace stairs, and whispered forgotten Latin in Stephen's ear until he went mad. It's catchy. The rhythm helps. The Church, for its part, tries to bury the entire episode again. Not literally this time, the body has been buried enough, but historically. Decrees are issued. Parchment is edited. Official records begin referring to the trial as irregular, which is like calling a house fire slightly unexpected. Future popes avoid the topic the way one avoids puddles that might actually be sewage. It becomes one of those things you don't mention at dinner, unless you're trying to ruin the meal or test the patience of a bishop. You can still feel the discomfort, even decades later. Every time someone brings up Formosus, there's a pause, a breath held. a glance exchanged. As though the very act of speaking his name might conjure a ghostly procession, one man, cloaked in decayed velvet, slumping forward with each step, trailing the scent of wet stone and unspoken accusations. Theologians have tried to explain it, of course. They point to factional disputes, political instability, the chaos following the collapse of Carolingian order. They use phrases like papal legitimacy crisis and theological tension between rival sees. But all the Latin in the world doesn't quite erase the fact that someone thought dragging a corpse into court was a good idea. And worse, that others agreed. And so Formosus lives on, not in prayer, not in liturgy, not in the golden pages of canonized saints, but in footnotes, in cautionary tales, in half-serious jokes whispered during late-night theological debates. He is remembered not for what he taught, but for what was done to him. Sometimes, that's all legacy means, being the punchline in someone else's terrible decision. There are places in the Vatican you're not supposed to go, not because they're locked or guarded, though some are, but because everyone quietly agrees not to notice them. You learn early that power in Rome is often less about what is said and more about what is simply never mentioned again. One such place is a records room deep beneath the papal apartments, where old documents are sent to nap forever. Some call it an archive. Others call it a graveyard. You call it what it is, a storage closet for inconvenient truth. It is here, between ledgers of tithes and letters that were never meant to be answered, that the records of the Cadaver Synod reside. Bound in cracked leather, handwritten in a Latin that gets more impatient as the pages go on, the trial transcripts are still there mostly intact, though someone has thoughtfully added a few inkblots over the more embarrassing lines. You skim the accusations, the responses, the sentence. None of it seems real. None of it seems designed to survive the weight of time. But there it is. Official. Unequivocal. A record of a day when men in robes spent hours yelling at someone who could not blink. Someone tried to refile it under miscellaneous. Another labelled it special proceedings. But the pages keep migrating. As though the documents themselves are restless, unwilling to stay buried, not unlike the man they describe. Every few years, a young clerk stumbles across them and asks, with the hopeful tone of someone new to church politics, "Is this real?" The answer, whispered like an ancient confession, is always the same. Yes, but we don't talk about it. And yet they keep talking. Quietly, guiltily, half smiling. Formosus' trial becomes a kind of ghost story among archivists. Don't work too late, they say, or the dead pope might start drafting memos. It's said with a laugh, but not a very confident one. Even among hardened scholars, there's something unsettling about paperwork that refuses to go away. You'd think, after all these centuries, it would fade, that someone would lose the file, or the parchment would crumble, or a rat would make a nest out of theological arguments and decrees written in rage. But no, the documents remain. They are recopied, dusted, whispered over. One scribe adds a marginal note in shaky Latin, "Lord, preserve us from another such day." No one erases it. What began as a political stunt, an absurd spectacle meant to erase a rival's influence, now lives on as an immovable entry in the church's memory. It cannot be defended. It cannot be undone. But it also cannot be deleted. The Cadaver Synod is too heavy to lift and too bizarre to bury. It just remains. Like a smell in the upholstery. Like a name you can't quite forget. Like regret, written on vellum. You'd think the whole point of digging up a pope and yelling at him would be to make people forget about him, disgrace him, undo his acts, throw his body in a river, and hope history quietly tiptoes away. But Formosus, being both inconvenient and dead, had other plans. Plans that didn't involve cooperation, or decomposition, or disappearance. It starts with the bishops. Not all of them, just a few who continue to reference his letters, his decrees, his appointments. They claim it's a matter of protocol, not sentiment. That the documents still bear the papal seal. That canon law requires consistency, but you can see it in their faces, a flicker of unease. Because if Formosus was wrong, so are they. And no one likes rewriting history when their name is already printed in the margins. Then the theologians get involved. They do what theologians always do when confronted with a mess. They divide it into categories and begin writing commentaries. Was Formosus validly Pope? Were his sacraments effective? Does the Holy Spirit work through papal fingers even after they've been ceremonially snipped? The questions get longer. The answers get fuzzier. A council is proposed, postponed, and quietly avoided. Meanwhile, in the countryside, no one cares. Farmers still pray. Priests still bless. Children are still baptized under the authority of bishops ordained by Formosus. You'd think a theological crisis might ripple outward. It does not. Most people shrug. Some don't even know he's dead. One man in Orvieto still claims he saw Formosus last spring, looked a bit damp, but walking fine. Inside Rome, the mood shifts. Not with explosions or banners, but with sighs. The papal court begins using his name again softly at first, then openly. His portrait is rehung in a hallway that gets very little foot traffic. His body is recovered from the Tiber, or a body presumed to be his, retrieved with enough ceremony to make people stop asking questions. He is reburied. Again, this time properly. The fingers are gone, but someone thoughtfully places a ring on what remains of one hand. And just like that, the attempt to erase becomes the reason he is remembered. No one forgets the synod. They might forget the wars, the politics, the disputes over territory and title, but they remember the trial, the throne, the silence, the absurdity. They remember the moment when death was no excuse, when decay did not exempt you from humiliation. You thought forgetting was easy. It's not. Memory is stubborn, especially when you try to smother it with spectacle, especially when you make it theatrical, especially when you try to shout it out of existence with a corpse propped in velvet. Formosus lives, not in virtue, not in victory, but in volume. He lives in the echo. If you stay in Rome long enough, you notice something odd about the way people talk about popes. Not the ones alive, now those are spoken of carefully, in measured tones, with polite phrases and too many titles. But the dead ones, the long gone ones, the complicated ones, they live in gossip. Not malicious gossip, but the kind that softens over time, becomes gentle, becomes almost affectionate, as if the distance between memory and present forgives the details. Formosus, the dead pope dragged into court, becomes one of these names. People stop saying the Cadaver Synod with revulsion and begin saying it with a kind of dark amusement, like a story about a neighbour's scandal that no longer hurts anyone. They forget the theological implications. They remember the visuals. A throne, a corpse, a man shouting accusations at a face that could not blink. History becomes theatre, and theatre becomes tradition. What lingers is not the voice of Formosus, because that never survived, but the robe. That papal robe, stained and sagging, wrapped around a body that had no business wearing it anymore. And yet, somehow, that image remains powerful. A symbol. A warning. A moment so ridiculous it turns sacred by accident. You start to realize that in Rome, the robe always matters more than the man. That's why the robe is reused. Not his that one was buried, burned, or perhaps quietly folded and forgotten, but others like it. Each pope wears the same silhouette. Each new figure inherits the old fabric of expectation. You may be alive, young, scholarly, or unimaginative, but once you put on that robe, you carry with you every mistake sewn into its hems. And Formosus is stitched there, silently, permanently, like a wine stain that embroidery can't hide. Sometimes, walking past the Lateran at night, you see a glimmer in a window. A candle left too long. A guard dozing beside a relic cabinet. But some say they've seen more than that, a figure seated in silence, too still to be alive, too solid to be imagined. A robe. A shadow. A posture familiar from paintings. No one speaks of it directly. They joke, then fall silent. Rome has too many ghosts, and too many of them know Latin. Even now, centuries later, popes hesitate to mention him. Not out of fear, not exactly, but out of a strange kind of professional discomfort. Because what do you say about a man who was tried for being a pope by the pope after him, who was buried twice, annulled once, and turned into metaphor by accident? You don't write him into sermons. You don't list him among the blessed, but you remember him, even if you won't admit it, because deep down, beneath the incense and the gold thread. Once you put on the robe, you might be seen forever even when there's nothing left inside. Eventually, Formosus stops being a person altogether. He becomes a story. A strange one. The kind you hear late at night, when the fire's gone low and the wine has turned sour in your cup. The kind that begins with a laugh and ends with someone staring too long at the floor. You hear his name tucked into sermons as a caution not about sin, but about spectacle. Not about pride, but about politics. At some point, his bones are moved again. Quietly, carefully. Officially, it's to preserve them from the damp. Unofficially, it's because someone kept reporting dreams, the kind where the Pope isn't dead, just sitting in the room, waiting to speak. But he never says anything. He only watches. This detail is repeated enough times that even the skeptical start lighting extra candles when they pass his tomb. You begin to wonder how long a legacy has to ferment before it turns into legend. For Formosus, it doesn't take long. His face is never canonized. No statues, no feast days. But he does appear in marginal drawings, the kind scribes make when they're bored or trying to express something they can't quite say aloud. A small figure in robes hovering awkwardly over a council meeting. A skeleton sitting on a throne, surrounded by bishops with long, unhappy noses. Once, even, as a corpse baptizing a child. That one is probably not official, but someone inked it carefully. These images spread, quietly. They're not printed in books, printing doesn't exist yet, but they're whispered across monasteries and copied into the corners of illuminated manuscripts. He becomes a visual rumor. A caution drawn in gold leaf. Ironically, the very absurdity of his story is what makes people doubt it. Surely not, they say. Surely the church didn't really drag a pope from his grave and put him on trial. You'd think the lack of belief would help him disappear. But it has the opposite effect. The more people question it, the more firmly the story roots itself. It becomes a test. Are you cynical enough to believe it? Or too faithful to admit it could happen? You can't quite blame them. The whole thing sounds like a parable written by a particularly bitter monk, a warning against pride, power, and trusting anyone named Stephen. But every part of it happened. The throne, the trial, the scissors, the silence, the river. And so you find yourself in a strange place where a man who died, and then was tried, and then died again in the memory of others still lingers. Not as a saint, not as a sinner, but as a reminder that the robe never protects you, that history doesn't care if it sounds ridiculous, that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to your memory is for people to remember it exactly. If you ever find yourself wandering the Vatican's quieter corners, not the parts gilded with gold or thronged with tourists, but the dusty back corridors lined with shelves and silence, you might stumble into a room that doesn't quite have a name. There's no official sign on the door. The clerks don't mention it. The air is cooler, not from architecture but from avoidance. You step inside, and the silence thickens. Not reverent silence, not holy stillness, just the kind of silence that feels like it's trying not to say something. Inside, there are drawers, hundreds of them labelled with years, popes, councils that didn't happen, councils that maybe shouldn't have. Each drawer holds documents. Some faded into near invisibility, others rewritten more times than anyone would care to count. Somewhere between Stephen VI and papal anomalies, you find the files. The ones no one opens unless absolutely required. They creak when you slide them out, like they resent being disturbed, and you can't help but wonder if the drawers are sighing, or if it's just you. Formosus's name is there, of course, in careful script in several different styles of handwriting. His papal acts, his correspondence, his excommunications all jumbled together like someone tried to organize them and gave up halfway through. But what catches your eye is a short, folded note wedged between pages, no heading, no date. Just a line in Latin, roughly translated as "leave him be." We've done enough. You don't know who wrote it. It's unsigned, unmarked. But it feels heavy, like whoever wrote it meant it to be read once and forgotten, and instead it was read again, and kept, and folded carefully like regret. That, in the end, is what remains of the Cadaver Synod, not the law, not the theology, but a long, slow retreat from explanation. A quiet backing away from the whole sordid display. No official doctrine ever forbade such trials, but no one ever attempted one again. That says more than any law could, because sometimes it's not the rules that stop people, it's the memory of how deeply embarrassed everyone looked afterward. As you close the drawer, you hear the soft thunk of wood on wood. Final, reluctant. You half expect the room to shake off your presence, like a dog drying itself after a bath. You leave quickly. Not because you're afraid, though you might be, but because you understand now that some memories are too strange to carry around without altering your posture. And outside, under the bright Roman sky, the world goes on as if no pope was ever dragged into court and stripped of his legacy by men who also wore white. As if the robe really does clean itself, no matter what it drapes over. But you remember, and so does the drawer. There's no plaque for it, no mosaic. No stained glass window showing a pope on trial, slumped and silent, while another pope points and declares things in Latin with too many syllables. The Cadaver Synod exists in the way an old injury exists, not always visible, not always spoken of, but present in the limping way certain things are remembered. You won't find it celebrated in church calendars. You won't hear it recited in Sunday homilies. But if you know where to look in the margins, in the pauses between chapters, in the words left out of prayers, you find it. What do you do with a story that doesn't end neatly? A pope dies. He is tried. Then buried, unburied, condemned, reburied, and forgiven by someone who also dies. The only thing consistent is the discomfort. The Cadaver Synod is too absurd for reverence, too cruel for comedy, and too well documented to forget. It sits in the archives like an overripe fruit someone is too polite to throw out. You might think it would inspire reform, and maybe, in a crooked, reluctant way, it does. Later popes become more careful, more deliberate, less theatrical. The lesson is not written into canon law, but into instinct. Never put your predecessor on trial, especially not when he's decomposing. It sets a tone, a precedent nobody wants to follow, a kind of unofficial policy shaped entirely by regret. Over time, the event becomes folklore, and folklore becomes something harder to correct. Versions multiply. In one telling, the corpse cries out. In another, it raises a hand to bless the court before collapsing backward. A particularly dramatic version claims that the sky darkened, that thunder rolled, and that the tapestries caught fire. None of these things happened, but they're more believable than what actually did. That's the danger, isn't it? When truth becomes indistinguishable from exaggeration, not because it's been twisted, but because the truth was already so strange that no one wants to believe it came unedited. The Cadaver Synod doesn't need embellishment. It only needs to be repeated. And each time it becomes harder to separate horror from performance, ritual from farce, decision from desperation. You walk past the Lateran Basilica, now scrubbed and silent, with newer stones covering older ones. Pilgrims enter and exit. None of them are here for formosus, but the floor remembers. The foundation remembers. The breeze that moves through the courtyard might carry nothing, or it might carry the faint rustle of a velvet robe, once dragged down an aisle by men who wanted to win an argument with a skeleton. There are no miracles associated with formosus, no recorded healings, no incorruptible body, just a name whispered through centuries by people who don't know whether to laugh, sigh, or light a candle. And yet, for a man who was supposed to be erased, he lingers, in silence, in dust, in drawers. You wake up in the apostolic palace, your ceiling painted by someone who died before your grandfather was born, your mattress made of feathers donated by birds who probably signed a papal waiver, and the light streaming in through a stained glass window that cost more than some cities. For a moment, everything is still, silent, serene. Then your spine protests, not because you've been sleeping on straw, but because marble is cold, even through velvet slippers, and your chamber is the size of a small cathedral with the warmth of a crypt. You are the Pope, not one of the loud ones. Not a martyr, not a warrior, not a mystic. You are a Renaissance Pope, and that means your job, aside from occasionally blessing armies you'll never follow and debating theological footnotes with men who only wear black, is to sit, to be seen, to look expensive. You do all of these things well, mostly. There are meetings. Always meetings. Cardinals who argue about things you don't understand, like diocesan boundaries and the appropriate number of candles per altar. You nod solemnly. You sip wine. You sign documents with a pen that has its own gold storage case. No one notices when you doodle in the margins a small fish, a bishop with angry eyebrows, a loaf of bread that looks vaguely suspicious. You expected holiness. You got logistics. You expected divine mystery. You got account ledgers, palace repairs, and the slow agony of selecting a new choir director. The last one died suddenly. Possibly of natural causes. Possibly of an aria too long. You don't ask questions anymore. You just move on to the next voice, the next banquet, the next official portrait where you must hold very, very still while trying not to look mildly annoyed. Your food is beautiful and mostly unchewable. Gold-leafed pears, custards stiff enough to qualify as fortifications, eels curled into symbols of prosperity. You eat because it is expected. You enjoy it less than you expected. Someone brings you something steaming in a bowl carved from crystal and murmurs, "It's meant to taste like virtue." It does not. It tastes like wet herbs and obligation. The art is the best part. You can't admit it aloud, popes don't have favourites, but you spend a little longer near the raffle rooms than necessary. You know the names of every paint pigment. You know how long it took to gild the ceilings. You walk slowly through corridors that make visitors gasp, and you pretend you're thinking about souls, not sailings. But the ceilings are beautiful. Souls are invisible. Sailings are not. You're not unhappy, but you're not entirely sure you're awake either. This life feels padded like sitting inside a jewel box. Beautiful, enclosed, airless. You are adored. You are obeyed. You are surrounded by brilliance. And yet, when the bells toll at noon, you feel nothing except a deep, ornate, expensive kind of tired. By your third month in the papal office, you've received 47 gifts that require their own room. Not metaphorically, literally. One ambassador sends you an ivory chess set so large that the knight pieces have stirrups. A French duke sends you a tapestry woven with gold thread, depicting, unfortunately, a heroic version of himself battling a lion that looks suspiciously like one of your cardinals. You hang it anyway. Politics is a decorative sport. Your wardrobe is a theological debate in itself. There are mourning robes, liturgical robes, diplomatic robes, and the always elusive casual ceremonial vestments, which seem to involve more pearls than comfort. The tailors boast so often you worry they'll forget how to stand upright. Every garment comes with a backstory, a saint it references, and an impracticality that defies comprehension. You once tried to walk in a brocade mantle, embroidered with the Acts of the Apostles. You didn't make it past the 3rd chapter before tripping on Matthew. People assume popes sit on one throne. You do not. You have thrones, plural. One for audiences, one for blessings, one for dining occasions where you must look solemn while chewing. There is even a travelling throne, collapsible, with velvet armrests and inconvenient wheels. You've seen dogs more agile. There's an entire closet dedicated to cushions of various densities, embroidered by nuns with frightening precision. One has your face on it. You pretend not to notice. And then there are the processions. At first you think they're ceremonial. Then you realize they're scheduled, weekly. Sometimes twice a week if a bishop is visiting or a new relic needs validating. You process through rooms, then halls, then across courtyards with a canopy held above you by 4 trembling seminarians, their expressions hovering somewhere between awe and early scoliosis. You wave. You nod. You try not to sneeze into the incense. Occasionally, pigeons observe from above with unnerving curiosity. Boredom arrives not with silence, but with layers. Layers of cloth, protocol, responsibility, and obligation disguised as honor. You are not allowed to be idle, but you are not expected to be busy either. Everything you do is ceremonial, and everything you avoid is done anyway by men who smile too much and bow too often. You once tried to cancel a meeting. 10 minutes later, it happened without you. The palace is never still. Couriers rush. Choir boys rehearse. A Flemish painter is having an existential crisis over the shade of blue in your official portrait. "It's too divine," he mutters. No one will believe it. You smile gently. You don't believe it either. But you wear the robe. You sit on the throne. You receive the gifts. You wave in the procession. You eat the goose. You nod at the tapestry of the French Duke mauling your cardinal. You do all of it because you are the Pope. And being the Pope is mostly pretending that you asked for any of this. There is no quiet in the papal court. Only layers of noise stacked atop each other like mismatched carpets, all velvet texture and no friction. Choir boys practice in one hall while masons hammer marble in another. The echo of sandals mixes with whispered Latin, and at any given moment, someone is arguing over grapes. Not theology. Grapes. The precise ripeness of grapes served to you at noon, because nothing in this world can be ordinary, not even fruit. Your audience chamber smells like paint and anxiety. There are frescoes in progress, oil portraits half done, and ceiling panels in perpetual purgatory. The artist speaks to the angels he's painting more than he does to you. You once asked him when it would be finished. He looked at you as if you'd insulted the concept of eternity itself. "Art is not finished," he said. It pauses. You nodded, because popes are not supposed to sigh. Around you, cardinals murmur constantly, offering opinions on things they do not control, and suggestions for things they never intend to follow up on. One insists that your left profile is more pious than your right. Another believes the Holy Spirit favors gold leaf over tempera. A third begins every sentence with "in my province," and ends every sentence with "as was divinely revealed to me in prayer." You no longer ask what happened during the prayer. Each day you receive diplomats who bow incorrectly. Some go too low and strain visibly. Others bow halfway and say "Your Highness," which is technically wrong but delivered with such confidence that you begin to question your own title. Their gifts are exotic, confusing, and often cursed. One king sends you a musical instrument no one can play. It hums on its own at night. Another sends a mirror said to reflect only the soul. You cover it with cloth. You begin to suspect your court is not real, not in the way other places are. It behaves more like a dream painted by someone who read too much Ovid and didn't understand restraint. Every movement is symbolic, every conversation choreographed. Even the servants glide like well-oiled furniture. They do not walk, they emerge. You are surrounded by theatre, but the script is unwritten, and the roles change daily. Your meals have names longer than the prayers you offer before them. Your portraits grow faster than your reputation. Your letters are drafted by men who add compliments you did not say and remove doubts you did. Your thoughts are filtered through 16 layers of etiquette, incense, parchment, wax seals, and the vague scent of rosewater that clings to everything whether you want it to or not. You are undeniably Pope. You have the stuff, the tiara, the rooms. But some days, especially on the 5th hour of your third audience of the morning, you feel more like the final detail in someone else's fresco. One that no one dares finish. One that just waits. It starts with good intentions. You decide, one morning, to reform something, anything. A gesture. A signal. A sign that you are not just here to wear embroidered slippers and nod at silverware. You gather the appropriate counsel, summon the most serious faces, and declare, in a tone both humble and firm, that the courier must reduce unnecessary spending. There's a pause. Someone coughs into a silk sleeve. A cardinal writes something down and underlines it 3 times, possibly unnecessary, possibly spending, possibly your name. Later, when the figures are returned to you on heavy parchment folded like gilt, you discover that the candles used in daily vespers cost more than an entire orphanage in Siena. You ask why. You are told that these candles are specially blessed, imported from a monastery where the bees sing hymns. You blink. You repeat the question. They begin talking about wax purity and ecclesiastical brightness. You do not understand, but you nod, and the candles stay. You try again. This time you suggest reducing the number of musicians hired for papal processions. Someone gasps audibly. Another clutches a psalter. A third points out, gently but with deep terror, that the oboe players have already been reduced once, and that another cut would violate a sacred contract with the local guild of liturgical woodwinds. You consider asking what exactly a liturgical oboe is. You do not. Undeterred or possibly just bewildered, you turn to the kitchens. You propose simpler meals, fewer courses, less gilded food. A cardinal faints. Another mutters something about culinary heresy. The head cook weeps silently while holding a trout stuffed with grapes and scented lavender, prepared for your lunch. You eat it anyway. It tastes like indecision and rose petals. At this point, you begin to suspect that the church is not built for efficiency. It is built for ceremony, for spectacle, for making small things vast and vast things incomprehensible. You wanted clarity. What you receive is a 2-hour explanation on the symbolism of gold-trimmed napkins. Even the candles, when you try to inspect them yourself, are presented like relics. Each wick is wrapped in parchment, each box sealed with red wax. A monk explains the light radius in theological terms. This glow, he says, is inspired by the Transfiguration. You nod again, this time more slowly, wondering how something so bright can leave you feeling so completely in the dark. And still, despite all the confusion, everyone insists you are doing marvelously. You are praised for your vision, thanked for your insight, applauded for your leadership. A tapestry is commissioned, depicting you holding a scroll, surrounded by rays of light and a noticeably well-lit candle. You do not recall posing for this. You wanted to change something, but everything remains carefully polished, slightly absurd, and more permanent than you. Even the bees keep singing. There's a garden behind the palace. It's not secret. Nothing in the Vatican is truly secret, but it's quiet. Quieter than the chapels, softer than the marble halls, shaded by cypress trees that have overheard more confessions than most cardinals. You find yourself walking here more often, not because you're especially fond of plants, but because it is the only place where no one tries to adjust your robe and whence your blessing while balancing a silver platter of pears. There's a small observatory tucked along the edge, barely a tower, more like a curiosity glued to the palace by someone who thought the stars should be closer to the church. The astronomer who works there, Brother Lucian, is either very brave or very indifferent. He speaks to you the way one might speak to a tired neighbour, not unkindly, but without reverence. He calls you Your Grace only when he remembers, and once accidentally offered you a biscuit from his pocket. He studies the sky, and he invites you, sometimes, to look. Not ceremonially. Not in a fresco-worthy scene with golden halos and flowing robes. Just you, squinting through a narrow tube, trying not to sneeze on the lens. He points out stars that don't move the way they're supposed to. He mentions gently that perhaps the heavens aren't quite arranged as everyone insists. You nod, because arguing with someone who has watched Jupiter for a month straight seems unwise. Also, he has the biscuits. You never write down what he says. You never mention it to the cardinals. But you think about it late at night, especially. About how the sky doesn't care who you are. About how the stars didn't pause when you were elected. About how being Pope doesn't give you a better view of the cosmos, just a different one. Higher, perhaps, but still filtered through cloud and uncertainty. The garden becomes your confessional, not the kind with screens and whispered guilt, but the kind where you remember how to walk without echo, how to speak without being written down. The ivy does not record your doubts. The grass does not translate your sighs into doctrine. You once stepped on a beetle and apologized. No one laughed. No one was there. You begin to suspect that holiness, if it exists, lies somewhere between the stars and the hedges, not in the council chambers, not in the tapestries, not in the ceremonial fish dishes that arrive with far too much parsley and no explanation. Holiness might be the quiet moment when you realize you are very small, that the sun will set without your permission, that your portrait will one day hang crooked in a hallway no one dusts. Lucian says the moon will be especially bright next week. You promise to come see it. He nods, as if it doesn't matter if you do or don't. That kind of freedom is rare. You envy him. There's a letter you've started writing. Not the official kind, not wrapped in ribbon and sealed with wax depicting keys and doves. This one is tucked in the drawer beneath your writing table, scratched in uneven ink on a page that smells faintly of lavender and old gilt. You don't know exactly who it's addressed to. Yourself, perhaps. Or maybe God, if he's willing to read things that weren't properly blessed by 6 secretaries and an archbishop. It begins, "I don't think I'm good at this. You haven't shown it to anyone." You won't, because popes don't confess in writing. Popes declare. They proclaim. They issue bulls and warnings and formal apologies that are, somehow, also victories. But in this letter, your handwriting stutters. You cross out the word failure 3 times before deciding to replace it with misunderstood. You aren't misunderstood, but it looks better on the page. You try to name the things that unsettle you, but they pile up too quickly. The way no one laughs in your presence, unless you start the joke. The way every hallway echoes with footsteps that aren't yours. The way no one tells you the truth, unless they believe it already flatters you. You once asked for honest feedback. You received a handwritten poem praising the elegance of your posture. It rhymed. You never asked again. You mention in the letter the reform you almost announced. A real one. Small but honest. You wanted to open the palace libraries to common scholars. Just a few. Quiet ones. Ones who knew Latin and smelled like ink. You even had the locks changed in anticipation. But someone reminded you gently, always gently, that too many questions can weaken the illusion of certainty. And the papacy, as you've learned, is a very delicate illusion indeed. The letter ends, or almost ends, with the sentence, "I hope it matters." Then nothing. You can't bring yourself to write more. You leave the parchment open, uncapped ink drying into disappointment. No one will find it. Not soon, anyway. The drawer where you've hidden it also contains broken rosary beads, a cracked seal stamp, and a tiny piece of marble from the chapel of St. Benedict, chipped off during a restoration no one dared finish. You return to your day. To the appointments, the blessings, the carefully rehearsed smiles. A German bishop wants to discuss liturgical dancing. A Portuguese envoy brings you fish wrapped in cloth so fine it might as well be silk. You nod. You pose. You remember to use the left profile, the more pious one. In the corridor just beyond your chamber, someone is dusting a tapestry. You've passed it 1,000 times. It shows a former pope not you feeding the poor. The colours have faded, and the beggars' faces look too clean to be real. Still, someone dusts it daily. The dust returns nightly. A quiet, holy loop. No one questions it. You close the drawer. The letter stays where it is. That, too, is tradition. They say everything in Rome turns toward you. Not just the faithful or the frightened, but the buildings, the processions, the furniture. Even the wind seems trained to wait for your signal. But what they don't say, what no one quite admits, is that being the centre also means being the blockage. The point through which all things must pass, and where most things get stuck. You are not the sun. You are the bottleneck. You spend an hour each morning listening to news from territories you've never visited, delivered by men who never admit they're guessing. They use confident tones to describe villages you suspect no one has seen in person since the last plague. The faithful remain strong, they say. The governor is loyal. You nod, while remembering that loyalty usually comes with a coin pouch and an exit plan. Your advisors talk around you, not to you. They reference policies you approved but don't recall. You smile in meetings where your opinion is already presumed. Occasionally, someone will pause and ask, "Is that agreeable to your holiness?" The question floats gently, designed not to seek an answer, but to confirm a performance. You always say yes. You stop trying to say anything else after the incident with the wine tax. Long story. Lots of grapes. No resolution. The walls around you are lined with mirrors, though none are for vanity. They reflect gold, vestments, visitors' reactions, and occasionally your own confusion. You once caught sight of your face during a particularly long chant, and were startled by how tired your eyes looked in Latin. You blinked. The chant continued. The mirror said nothing. Even your schedule is composed for you. Entire hours are pre-labelled with events you will not remember and people you will never see again. Reception with Florentine Sculptor Guild. Blessing of new irrigation proposals. Audience with man who claims to own the finger of St. Bartholomew. You go. You nod. You listen to explanations you could not repeat 5 minutes later. One time, someone presented you with a carved wooden duck meant to symbolize divine providence. You told them it was beautiful. It was actually a spoon. You've learned to move slowly, not just for dignity, but for practicality. If you walk too fast, things happen. Requests catch up to you. People become emboldened. You once made the mistake of turning left too quickly and found yourself at an unplanned wedding. You officiated it anyway. You were congratulated afterward, though you never caught the names. Every moment you are present, you are performing, not because you're insincere, but because the role demands it. The hat is tall. The robe is heavy. The expectations are both contradictory and non-negotiable. You are expected to speak with divine certainty and absolute humility, often in the same sentence. And if you hesitate even once, 12 bishops write about it, and one artist sketches it into the background of a future fresco, where you'll be forever paused between grace and indecision. Tonight there's another banquet. Of course there is. There is always another banquet. This one is for a cardinal's birthday, or perhaps a military victory, or maybe it's just Thursday. You've stopped asking. The long table is laid with linen so fine it whispers when touched. The plates are gold, again. The knives are too sharp to use, again. The centerpiece is a swan made of sugar, again, though someone has cleverly posed it this time with a turnip in its beak, meant to represent humility. You stare at it for a while before remembering to look appreciative. You sit at the center, as always, raised slightly, not so much that it's rude, just enough that everyone must tilt their eyes to meet yours. This is meant to symbolize guidance. It mostly symbolizes neck strain. People toast to your health with words you've heard, so often they've lost all shape phrases about light, eternity, and the wisdom of your reign. Someone says you shimmer with sanctity. You nod slowly, trying not to shimmer with indigestion. The meal lasts 4 hours. By the second hour, you've stopped tasting anything. By the third, you begin blessing things without waiting to hear what they are. This pottage, bless it. This lute performance by a child in feathers, bless him. This tax proposal involving river tolls, bless it. You say the word so many times it empties. It becomes a noise, like coughing, but polite. No one expects you to be full of joy, but they expect you to be full of food, of presence, of meaning. The performance is unrelenting. You must chew with grace, smile without thought, and laugh only when others do. You are not permitted to lead laughter. That, apparently, would be undignified. You are allowed to suffer, though, quietly, and preferably in Latin. At one point, a young monk leans too far forward, while serving something that smells like smoked clams and lemon-soaked bread, and the entire dish topples into your lap. Gasps, silence, a flicker of scandal. But you simply rise, gently, with a smile so polished it could be set in glass, and declare that this is a blessing. A holy accident, you say. The monk nearly faints. You bless him again for good measure. The clams are removed. The robe is discreetly brushed. The banquet continues. And as it does, you wonder not aloud, never aloud, whether anyone feels the blessings anymore. Whether they travel, whether they settle, or whether they dissolve the moment they leave your lips and fall onto tables groaning with excess. You wonder if they mean something when said in sincerity, or if the repetition has polished them into decoration. No one tells you. No one can. You're the only one here not allowed to ask the question. You bless the turnip in the sugar swan's mouth. People clap. You say thank you. The next course arrives. It smells like victory and regret. You've been summoned politely, of course, to the northern cloister, where the light always falls too brightly for comfort, and where statues seem to multiply in corners like devout weeds. The sculptor is waiting. Not the usual court artist, but a celebrated Florentine, flown in metaphorically on wings of flattery, coin and enough wine to christen a fleet. He has a sketchbook, a chisel, and the calm, unsmiling expression of someone who believes the soul can be captured in stone if you just squint hard enough. You sit for him. Or rather, you are sat positioned, draped, angled like a ceremonial ham waiting for veneration. He circles you. He hums occasionally, not musically, but in the distracted manner of a man measuring the distance between nose and virtue. You wonder what he sees. The man, the Pope, or just a collection of features to be translated into something that might outlive the building. He asks if you can look a little more eternal. You try. You soften your gaze. You lift your chin. You adjust your fingers so that they suggest both blessing and disinterest. He doesn't comment, just nods and begins tapping marble with the deliberation of a monk peeling an orange during Lent. You expected flattery. Instead, you get silence. A silence so heavy it seems to mould the air itself. Hours pass. You shift once. He frowns as if you've committed a theological crime. Eventually, a break is suggested. You rise gently, hoping to creak less than the chair. He studies the half-shaped bust without speaking. It looks familiar and strange, like a version of you that would argue less and listen more. You leave before it blinks. Outside, you realize something peculiar. Statues of popes rarely smile. They gesture, they glare, they bestow wisdom through jawlines and granite brows, but they do not smile. You ask why, once. The answer came from a nun arranging flowers near a statue of Gregory IX. She didn't look up when she replied. Smiling is for the living. Then she added more lilies. You wonder sometimes who these statues are for. They don't seem to comfort anyone. Children don't like them. Visitors walk past them on the way to things that sparkle. They're too large for affection, too cold for reverence. But they endure, more than you will. They keep your name long after your voice fails. They hold a version of you you barely recognize, smooth, fixed, permanent, unimpressed by memory. Back in your chambers, you remove your ring with the same motion as always. You set it down. It rolls half a circle before stopping decisively, as if even the furniture has memorized your rituals. You look at your hand. The sculptor will get it wrong. They always do. The marble will smooth over the tremor, ignore the scars, soften the bones. You'll be made into something holy. You'll be made into something still. But you, the you wake up with, will not be in the stone. You wake up one morning and realize your portrait is already hanging in the corridor, the long one with the cool tiles and the echo that sounds slightly judgmental. It wasn't supposed to be finished yet. The artist said he needed more time, but here it is. You stare at it for a long time. You look noble, possibly divine, certainly well fed. The background is all clouds and distant hills, suggesting vision, leadership, and perhaps a recent picnic. You don't remember approving any of it. You notice the inscription below your image. Your name, of course, all 12 syllables of it, followed by a year, and another year, and then a phrase in Latin that was chosen by someone else. It says something about unity, or eternity, or both. You can't quite tell. The grammar feels off. You think about correcting it, but what would be the point? No one remembers popes for their Latin grammar, only for their wars, their scandals, their miracles, or, occasionally, their astonishing silence. There's a ceremony later that day, a final one. Final in the sense that it commemorates something that has not yet ended, but is clearly winding down. You walk slowly, people applaud. You raise your hand, you bless the air. You smile at children who were told to look grateful. You pass through rooms named after saints you never read about, whose statues have better posture than you do. At dinner, the wine is sweeter than usual. Someone makes a toast. Another someone mentions your legacy. A third gives you a document to sign. You do. You don't ask what it is. You've stopped asking. They usually mean well, and the consequences rarely arrive on time. Later, in the quiet of your study, you sit by the window. The light is soft, the kind that makes everything look a little more permanent than it really is. You listen to the pigeons arguing in the courtyard. You remember a banquet where someone dropped a trout into your lap. You remember the monk with the telescope. You remember the letter you didn't send, the candle no one lit, the statue that doesn't quite look like you. You wonder, not for the first time, what happens to popes after history forgets their titles. Do they become footnotes? Frescoes? Do they linger in dust, in policies no one follows, in footfalls on stone corridors too long to remember every echo? Or do they simply stop being anything, just names carved into marble, mispronounced by tourists and nodded at by tired guides. You close your eyes. You are not dying. Not yet. But the day is tired, and so are you. Tomorrow there will be another meeting, another procession, another banquet, another chance to appear eternal while quietly forgetting where you left your reading glasses. The robe is heavy. The gold is polished. The name is still yours, but only you know how much of yourself is already elsewhere. And so, the lights dim in the halls of your memory. The velvet has faded, the gold has dulled, and the marble underfoot remembers more than it should. You were not the first pope to wonder if any of it mattered, and you were certainly not the last. The procession continues, without your name, without your sigh, but with the same rhythm, the same incense, the same script. Another robe will be worn, another face painted, another silence blessed by accident. And now, as you lie there, you know the loop will wait once more for you.